Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where we will be doing our weekly wrap up about the American founders I published articles about just this week. Now, I do want to get a few announcements out of the way as people start rolling in. First of all, I apologize that this is a few hours late. Unfortunately, we got a little caught up at the zoo today. Now, I also want to note doing these on Sundays was kind of an experiment. And while it's a lot of fun, and I know a lot of you really enjoy coming, and hi, Mr. Adams, thank you for enjoying my new background. But I know a lot of you really enjoy having it on Sundays. Unfortunately, the experiment, from my perspective, is not working out very well. It really hampers my ability to be a parent with my family. So not this week, but next week is going to be the last time we do the wrap up on Sundays. I'm going to move it back during the week. I'm going to start doing it on Thursdays again. And I do apologize for those of you who do like coming on Sundays, but 6 days a week has turned out to be a little much for me and my family. So I appreciate you understanding. Additionally, while we're understanding things, after next week's weekly wrap up, I am going to take a few days off, about a week off. I will be doing live videos I'm taking a trip to visit my family. I will be doing some live videos from there. They will be just a little different. But after 3 years without a single day off, I am taking a week. I sure hope you can understand that. When we come back, we'll start our new system where Monday through Wednesday, 8:15 on weekdays, Eastern Standard Time, I will be hopefully interviewing people all 3 days. If not, I'll just be giving you founders myself. Thursdays, we'll do the weekly wrap-up. Fridays, we'll do trivia. Now that is out of the way again, I appreciate your understanding. This week's still going to be the same. Let's get into the American founding, shall we? Let's take a look. So, the first founder we are going to be reviewing today is Henry Pelham. Now, Henry Pelham, as it says next to me, is the man who really did the Boston Massacre engraving. Now, I am going to show you a picture of the engraving in just a second, but just so you know, I am speaking about the famous picture of the Boston Massacre, the one that everyone saw, and the one that Paul Revere was made famous for engraving. It's one of the earliest forms of American propaganda, and it really drove a lot of people towards the American cause. But we're talking about Henry Pelham. Now, Henry Pelham was born in America, and his father died young. Unfortunately, his father had a bit of an untimely death, but he had a much older half-brother whose name was John Singleton Copley. And you might recognize the name John Singleton Copley. John Singleton Copley was an American founder. I'm sorry, not an American founder, a famous artist, a portrait artist for the most part, but he did many things. Now, John Singleton Copley actually grows up, and he does this painting of Henry Pelham, his younger brother. And this painting of his younger brother ends up making him fairly renowned as an artist. And John Singleton Copley ends up going over to London I believe it's 1775, just as the American Revolution is breaking out. Really because if you wanted to make it as an artist, you really should go to London or somewhere in Europe. So he goes to London and becomes John Singleton Copley. His brother, Henry Pelham, also becomes an artist, not quite as well known, but when the Boston Massacre happens, Henry Pelham does an engraving of the Boston Massacre, and he shows his friend, Paul Revere. And Paul Revere then goes and essentially steals it. And Henry Pelham gets very upset because he wanted everyone to see his, and he trusted Paul Revere. And it took Henry Pelham 3 weeks to get his printed, and Paul Revere only 2. And I'm going to show you right now a side by side, and this is from the Massachusetts Historical Society, so big shout out to them. But these are the engravings. So the one on the left is Paul Revere, and the one on the right is Henry Pelham. Now, as you can see, there is a lot of similarities between these two. I mean, right down to the point where, if you look down at the bottom here, they both have a dog, they both have a guy pouring blood out of exactly the same spot, guy lying on the ground here, guy grabbing a leg over here, and if we scroll up, I mean, it's essentially the same painting. I will say the one on the right, which is Henry Pelham's, is a lot more detailed. It looks a lot nicer. And the way you can really tell them apart is the moons are facing different directions. Is one of the several things I've read and have seen. Also, Pelham has some hands in the air, and Paul Revere does not. Paul Revere is a lot more crude, which is, again, I think, extremely fascinating. I'll pull my things back up here. So that is a comparison between Henry Pelham's engraving and Paul Revere's engraving. Now, you can see how Pelham would be quite upset. In fact, I read a very interesting letter, which I believe is linked to in my article, Pelham writing to Paul Revere, basically saying, hey, Paul, you stole my stuff. I let you look at mine, and you copied it. To which I did not find a very good answer to Paul Revere, but very interesting in the letter. It's a very brief letter calling out Paul Revere's honor, which I'm a little surprised it didn't lead to a duel, because he's very specifically calling out Paul Revere's honor. And then at the end he says, oh yeah, by the way, my mother's still hoping to get those cufflinks you promised you'd make for her. It wasn't cufflinks, but Paul Revere is a silversmith. You still owe my mom that silver. By the way, can we get that errand done? Now, Henry Pelham ends up shortly thereafter moving to London and essentially becoming a loyalist. He becomes fairly outspoken against the Patriots, probably in large part due to Paul Revere being kind of a jerk. Now, I will also note, a lot of other people end up stealing this same picture. It is kind of the thing to do, to steal pictures like this. But he ends up going to London, rejoins his brother over there, and ends up spending the rest of his life over in Europe. So he's on the fringe of a founder, but again, it was his Henry Pelham's little engraving that inspired Paul Revere's engraving, which is now arguably the most famous picture from the American Revolution itself. That is a little bit about Henry Pelham. Let's pop over here. That's not where we're popping. We're popping over here. What am I doing here? Why don't we get you in the game? We're late in the day. Sorry, everyone. Late in the day. All right. Our next founder is Robert Morris, who was Chief Justice of New Jersey during the Revolutionary War. Now, when you hear the name Robert Morris, you usually think Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, who headed the Marine Department and Foreign Affairs for a while over in Philadelphia. This is a different person who has exactly the same name by chance. Now, we talked about him briefly earlier in the week when we looked at the Morris family tree. This Robert Morris is a cousin to a Declaration signer and a cousin to a Constitution author and a cousin to the Chief Justice of Revolutionary New York. Now, Robert Morris's father, Robert Hunter Morris, had been for 25 years Chief Justice of colonial New Jersey. But when the Revolutionary War breaks out, this Robert Morris is still a young man making his name in private practice. But once independence is declared, New Jersey, well, they need new people in all the positions. You have to be with the revolutionaries. Robert Morris seems to have kept his name a little bit out of things as a younger man trying to establish his business, but he was eventually asked and appointed to be clerk of county in New Jersey. The exact county escapes him, but he's appointed as a county clerk. Now, 6 months later, he's given another position. He is promoted from county clerk to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New Jersey. It is quite a move. Now, to be fair, he came from the Morris family, and his father had held this position in colonial New Jersey, as I said, for 25 years. So he was kind of expected always to have taken this position, even had the king stayed around. But since he's never comes out as a loyalist, never really comes out as a patriot, not at the beginning anyway, but never comes out as a loyalist, they say, well, let's just take him, and, how are you going to turn that job down, right? So he takes it, and he's only there for about 2 years. I found it notable that of the 2 years he's Chief Justice of New Jersey Supreme Court, he continues to be county clerk for a year and a half. So he doesn't neglect his county clerk duties when he's, Chief Justice. Granted, it was wartime. There wasn't a lot of Chief Justicing to do at the time. And he gets out before things settle down and you need to do some Chief Justicing. But he does hold that position, as I said, for 2 years. He goes back to private practice for a little bit, but then he is actually chosen by George Washington as a federal judge. He is federal judge for the United States District Court, District of New Jersey. And he spends 25 years in that position. Just like his father was Chief Justice of New Jersey for 25 years, he is a federal justice for the following 25 years till basically the end of his life when he ends up retiring. That's a brief overview of the Robert Morris who is Chief Justice of New Jersey, often overshadowed by all his cousins who signed things, and another person by a different name, by the same name, who signed a lot of things. That was pretty brief, not a whole lot on him. Now, we are going to pop over here to James Morris. So, our next founder is James Morris III. James Morris III is not related to the famous Morris family of New Jersey. There are several separate families that do go by that name. I should have said the famous Morris family of New York and New Jersey. They are more popular, more famous. Now, James Morris III was from Connecticut, and he was lower level. He did want to become a minister, and he goes to Yale to pursue this dream. Unfortunately, that never comes into action because while he's as soon as he graduates college in 1775. So a few weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, right about the time there's a Battle of Bunker Hill, he graduates college. Because he had a degree, he was asked to be an officer, an ensign, which I know I mispronounced, ensign, in the Connecticut militia. And this is the lowest level officer you can be, but an officer nonetheless. And he does join the fight. He fights in several parts of the New York and New Jersey campaign. And then eventually he is captured at the Battle of Germantown. This is not great because he ends up spending the next 4 years, plus 4.5 years, in the British custody. A majority of the war. Now, the first year or so, and we know he does end up writing a memoir later in life, and that's how we know most of this information. So the first year or so, he's actually kept in deplorable conditions in Philadelphia. And he doesn't have a bed to sleep on. He doesn't have windows. He's in a cold, dark cell, sleeping on the floor. He's very fortunate. His health does not take a turn for the worse, but he's very nice to his captors. He was a college graduate, which was unusual at the time, so some of the other officers did have a certain amount of respect for him, and they did loan him books while he was in there. So after about a year, he gets what they call it parole, but he's sent to New York, technically Long Island, where he lives basically in a house with another person. Just a British loyalist who has a house and a very nice library. That person's name escapes me, but he did let Mr. Morris use his library. And according to Morris, this was the time he realized he wanted to be an educator. He learned just a ton of different things, reading all these books, had nothing but leisure time on his hands. Eventually, he's paroled. And he goes and rejoins the army. He finds out he's been promoted to captain. Well, that's great. And he joins the battle at Yorktown. And he is serving under Alexander Hamilton's brigade. And he helps with the taking of Redoubt Number 10, which is famously where the most risking your life action was during the final battle. And he participates. He survives. He goes home. He's kind of a hero. He gets married pretty much right away. His neighbors choose him as a justice of the peace and a town selectman, which means, although it's on a very small scale for his local community, he is, helps make the laws and helps him not enforce the laws, but be a justice, determine, who's breaking what laws. He also starts educating his children and several neighboring children. And this is where Morris gets his title as an early American coeducator. Other people had educated both genders before this, but he just starts bringing in neighborhood kids, and more come. And then he starts charging them some money. And then the local church has not a court case, but a big meeting where they're saying, well, he's teaching boys and girls at the same time. That can't be good. And most of the church was like, it's fine. And they end up letting it go. Nothing comes of it. So Morris ends up starting what's known as the Morris Academy. And the Morris Academy would eventually, a few years later, actually built a school. They built a separate building for Morris to bring in these children to educate. And they did. And that school was open well past his death until the 1880s. It was open almost a century before it shut down. And it was really the first one that successfully taught both boys and girls at the same time. Again, fairly controversial at the time. Not only giving girls a boy's education, but actually teaching them in the same rooms. That wouldn't be common for another century, about the time the school closed down. And he does this. Now, I should note, he has a bunch of kids, and he gets sick at one point between the two kids, and a neighbor comes to help him and his family while he's sick. That neighbor had a 5-year-old daughter. 30 years later, when Morris's wife dies, that 5-year-old daughter would be approaching her 30s and actually become Morris's second wife. I know he sounds like a cool guy. We've been talking about a lot of cool things. That's a little iffy. Not really pumped about it. But it was a different time, and she was in her 30s by that point. So if you're in your 30s, you can marry someone in your 60s. That's fine. I'm not here to judge you. So that is a bit about Morris. I see Paul Revere Misfit popping in here saying it was a loyalist named Mr. Clarkson. Thank you, Paul Revere. Mr. Clarkson was the name of the loyalist. And that is James Morris. A very brief summary of James Morris. Again, there's a link in the article, linked below, to read his biography, or his memoir, I should say, if you're interested in that. A very interesting person who really kind of changed the game in America when it came to educating young women. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, because we are rocking through them today, huh? Just a lot of exciting founders today. And who's next on the list? Not a Morris, John Pickering. Okay, real quick. I'm going to make a side note. Our next founder is John Pickering. I want to do a brief aside and say that there are two John Pickerings during the American Revolution. One is brothers with Timothy Pickering, who was a very important person in the Washington administration. This is not Timothy's brother. This is John Pickering from New Hampshire, who ends up being a judge. Now, Pickering was a successful lawyer. As the revolution broke out, he was becoming a successful lawyer. He doesn't really jump into the war at first, but he does help New Hampshire write its first and then later second constitution. And after this, he's brought in to, after independence, he becomes a member of the state House of Representatives. So he does help create New Hampshire, but it's not until later, when he is actually chosen as Chief Justice of the state of New Hampshire, that he really comes into play. Being a Chief Justice is an extremely important job after the war is over, as we mentioned before. Now, he's in this position for 5 years when President George Washington chooses him to sit as on the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire. He becomes a federal judge for New Hampshire, representing, again, the federal government when it comes to cases involving New Hampshire. So, he does this well for about 8 years, and then, sadly, his mental facilities start to deteriorate. And he actually ends up making some fairly poor decisions on the court. It's about this time that President Jefferson, now President Jefferson, submits articles of impeachment to try and remove John Pickering from office. Now, you hear a lot of talk, reading through the letters at the time, about drunkenness. They're accusing him of drunkenness and malpractice. The truth of the matter is, the articles of impeachment don't specifically say anything like this. They just accuse him of the one thing you can be impeached for: crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the argument presented by Federalists, because Pickering was a Federalist, the argument presented by the Federalists was, well, what crimes did he commit and what misdemeanors did he commit? Sure, he's losing his mind, but that's not a reason to remove someone from office, not according to the Constitution. Can't be removed for losing your mind. And then, to which the Democratic Republicans responded, yeah, you can. It's, it might not be a crime, but he's making misdemeanors with these really obviously poor decisions he's making. And it was kind of known at the time. Like, he was sadly losing his faculties. When it goes to the House of Representatives, they impeach him by an extraordinary margin. It was like 45 to 5, or I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was in the 40s to single digits. So the House was like, yeah, absolutely get rid of him. It goes to the Senate, and it's not quite as disparaging, but it's an overwhelming decision to remove him from office. And he is removed, and sadly he dies just a year later after, I guess not a lifetime of service to the American Revolution, but certainly a good amount of service to his country. That's a brief summation of John Pickering, who is the first federal judge to be successfully impeached. I guess I should note, Samuel Chase was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court that was impeached, but then when it went to trial in the Senate, he did not get convicted of his crimes. John Pickering is the first person to have an impeachment go to the Senate and be convicted and removed from office. Lots of fun. All right, we're just swimming through it today, huh? Who's next? Brutus. Okay. Our next founder is Brutus. Brutus number 13. Now, after a few papers where Brutus wasn't necessarily hitting the mark, in my personal opinion, Brutus number 13 comes back pretty hard. Now, he does start off by acknowledging certain rights that justices should have. And in this paper, he focuses again on justices and the judicial branch under the Constitution and some of its flaws. And he does, say, okay, some of this is proper, fine. But then he starts talking about government notes. Government notes are essentially what we would consider bonds. At the time, especially during the Revolutionary War, but even afterward, just like they do with bonds today, the separate state governments would issue notes to individuals as a way to fund first the war and then the government itself. It's a promissory note. Here, yeah, you give us some money and we'll give you this note, and then eventually we'll pay you back with interest. We promise. And Brutus takes exception with the idea that individuals could sue entire states in federal court. Because if an individual has one of these promissory notes and wants to collect right now, well, they can call that in without anything illegal happening. And if someone has a note they bought from their state and sells it to someone in a different state, well, now a person could take an entire state to federal court to sue them for money that's owed. First of all, this would be extraordinarily embarrassing to a state who, Brutus points out, should be sovereign. And additionally, well, the states didn't have this money necessary to pay back right now. That's why they gave out these notes in the first place. The states were taking out debt in the first place, first to win the war, and now to get off the ground as independent states. And if a state was sued by an individual, the individual was probably being right to try and collect money owed to them, depending, of course, on the agreement. And that means the federal government, if the justices were doing things appropriately, would look and award the people these money. So the states would have to pay money to these individuals. Presumably, all the individuals would come collecting at once, and the states would all go bankrupt. On top of the fact that, as Brutus discussed in earlier papers, that the federal government is now taking a substantial portion of the tax money that the states were collecting. The states have even less money coming in. People are not going to take out any more notes because they see the state's not going to be able to pay them back. And every state, according to Brutus, would probably go bankrupt. And if they're bankrupt, they need to rely on the federal government. And the more the states rely on the federal government, they lose their independence as separate states. And it becomes one consolidated national government instead of a federated government as was being promised by the Federalists. Though again, I will remind you, the Anti-Federalists were the ones who wanted a federal government, and the Federalists were the ones who wanted a national government with like some federalism. James Madison famously puts it in one of the Federalist Papers, part national and part federal, as opposed to the Anti-Federalists who just wanted federal. So that is a brief summation of Brutus number 13. It's a little bit of a complicated one to get through, but once you boil it down, this one's more about economics than pretty much any of the other ones. Even the tax ones weren't so based in economics, so it would take me a while to make sure I sorted it out. But an interesting note is that as soon as the federal government's created, Alexander Hamilton puts through his tax plan, his assumption bill, that is fairly famous at this point. And he does essentially the same thing. He starts giving out promissory notes to private investors. John Jay once put it, well, I should say John Jay's son, William Jay, wrote a biography of John Jay, and in it he said that one of John Jay's favorite maxims was to say, those who own the country ought to govern it. And it is a very interesting point of view from one of the most important American founders, and how many of the American founders thought. They did think that the elites who had the money and were in control should make the decisions. They're the ones whose money it is. They're the ones who have assembled the power to oversee the nation. They might as well have the authority to do so. And that is part of the justification behind not only the promissory notes the federal government would later put out, but the promissory notes that were put out during the war and during the creation of these separate states, much to a very large degree. So again, that's Anti-Federalist, Brutus number 13. Thank you guys for joining us. Definitely make sure you like while I pop up these next ones. We're going to talk about one of my favorites here. And I am going to brief through a substantial portion of Oliver Ellsworth's life to get to the goods. So our next founder is Oliver Ellsworth. Oliver Ellsworth is essential to the American Revolution. On my annual draft, he's almost always in the top 20 most important American revolutionaries. He's a guy everyone should know if you're interested in the American Revolution. He was influential in early Continental Congress. He ends up going to the Constitutional Convention, where he is one of the authors, one of the members of the Committee of Detail, which is supposed to assemble and create the United States Constitution. Not sadly, but he ends up returning home a little bit early because there's things going on at home. So he doesn't actually sign the Constitution, but he is a framer of the United States Constitution. He's then sent back to New York because he is an inaugural member of the United States Senate. Now, James Madison ends up not getting chosen as a senator for various reasons, but James Madison goes and becomes an important member of the House of Representatives, and he works very closely with Oliver Ellsworth in the Senate to do several things, including creating the Judiciary Act of 1790. The Justice Department, as we spoke about not too long ago, talking about Brutus, the Justice Department of the United States government is actually left up in the Constitution to be created and overseen by the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So they get to work almost as soon as the government opens in creating the judiciary branch of the United States government, and that leads to the Judiciary Act of 1790. And the Judiciary Act of 1790, as I said, basically assembles the United States court system. So, he acts as a senator for a while. Like I said, he works with James Madison. John Oliver, when James Madison writes the Bill of Rights, he sends it to his buddy Oliver Ellsworth, who is the one who presents it to the United States Senate. And then the United States Senate votes to approve it. Now, so he plays a major role in creating the Bill of Rights. Of course, those Bills of Rights would go to the separate states as amendments and have to be voted on by the states, so we can't give him all that much credit, but he did present it to the U.S. Senate. After this, he is appointed as the third Chief Justice of the United States of America. John Jay was Chief Justice for a while, and then he left, and there was an interim appointment, John Rutledge, who probably would have been a full-time Chief Justice if he didn't make some terrible comments about the Jay Treaty, and kind of talk trash about George Washington there, and then try to kill himself. So John Rutledge, after a lifetime of service and an important founder in his own right, after he's kind of out, Oliver Ellsworth, who helped create the court system in the first place, is brought in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, while he's still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Ellsworth, and this is what I want to focus on, Oliver Ellsworth is sent by President John Adams to be envoy extraordinary to the court of France. This is important because he goes with two other ambassadors. They go to the Convention of 1800, which we spoke about not too long ago. The Convention of 1800 is because the quasi-war with France had broken out. It was kind of a war, a naval war, but like not really, because we didn't declare war. Not yet. Not ready for that, USA. They go over and they end up fixing the problem started with the XYZ affair, saying we're not going to let you bribe us, blah, blah, blah. But then they end a war. They end the quasi-war, largely to the importance of envoy extraordinary Oliver Ellsworth. Again, while he's Chief Justice of the United States of America, he comes back to the United States, resigns not too long afterward, being replaced by John Marshall, who would be there for a very long time. And Ellsworth ends up spending his retirement as a special advisor to Connecticut's governor. Because why not? I do want to note that it's also interesting is that in 1794, you have John Jay, sitting Chief Justice of the United States, go to England to negotiate a treaty. And 6 years later, you have Oliver Ellsworth, sitting Chief Justice of the United States, sent on a boat across the ocean to negotiate a treaty with France. And it does indicate exactly how important their authority was during the founding of the United States. Oliver Ellsworth is one of those names that you just don't hear, despite the fact that you really should. He's essential to the creation of the United States of America. Absolutely essential. I hope you learned a little bit about him. I recommend going and reading more about him because I've glazed over an entire fascinating life. His involvement at the Constitutional Convention, like I said, I glazed over him as part of the Committee of Detail. Unfortunately, like many people who don't actually sign the documents, he does not necessarily get the credit he deserves. So that's a grossly brief assessment of the life of Oliver Ellsworth, 3rd Chief Justice of the United States of America. Let's pop up here. Who's our last founder? Speaking of people who don't get the credit they deserve. Our next founder is Ira Allen. Now, Ira Allen is not nearly as famous as his brother, Ethan Allen. Now, Ethan Allen gets a lot of credit as a leader of the Green Mountain Boys and a soldier in the American Revolution, taking Fort Ticonderoga. There was a chain store named after him that at least was in the Northeast. I don't know if there was an Ethan Allen by you. I think they sold furniture. I'm not sure. Ira Allen, also just as important to the creation of Vermont, though he doesn't do the wartime heroics, so he doesn't get that thumbs up light shined on his special times. Ira did move with his brother to Vermont about the same time when it was still like being debated are we New York, are we New Hampshire, are we our own thing? Ira Allen does help form the Green Mountain Boys, but once the war breaks out and the Green Mountain Boys go out to do the fighting, well, there is some necessary things that have to happen at home. And Ira Allen is the one they decide stays back and organizes Vermont. Not only does he organize Vermont, but he's organizing Vermont while everyone else doesn't think there's a Vermont. At this point, he is one of the important people when Vermont declares independence from Great Britain and the other colonies, and technically, according to Vermont, they were their own nation. According to everyone else, they were not. But I like to say they were their own nation. So he ends up becoming the first treasurer and first surveyor general of the independent nation of Vermont, and later almost state of Vermont. And he spends over a decade in both of these positions. These are very important. First of all, treasurer during the founding of a state and during a wartime. Controlling the money is vital to how things are organized and operated. And furthermore, survey general at a time when New Hampshire was claiming it was part of the New Hampshire grants and New York was claiming it was part of New Hampshire, figuring out boundaries was amazingly important. Additionally, you got British-French Canada on the northern border that also had to be resolved. So eventually, Allen is actually sent by Vermont to the Continental Congress. Now, he is not a Continental Congress delegate because the Continental Congress did not recognize Vermont as a colony or a state. They didn't want to get involved in that debate between New Hampshire and New York that New Hampshire and New York were having, excluding the people who actually lived in the area who considered it Vermont. But he does go to the Continental Congress. He tries to plead for Vermont to be recognized. And again, this is unsuccessful, but he meets William Samuel Johnson of Connecticut. William Samuel Johnson, another important founder who would go to the Constitutional Convention, just a really important guy. He sympathizes with Vermont, who, by the way, Connecticut also claimed Vermont because it was on the Connecticut River, does go up there, but absolutely no one took that seriously. But William Samuel Johnson sympathizes with Allen and Vermont, and he agrees to represent Vermont in the Continental Congress. Technically, he was only there representing Connecticut, but unofficially, he was also looking out for Vermont. So again, Ira Allen gets a Continental Congressman to represent their home during the debates. Again, it's a second thought for for Johnson and everyone else, but still, it's done. Allen goes home and then does a little artwork, and he designs the Great Seal of Vermont, which Vermont still uses to this day, the Great Seal of Vermont. It's at this point that Ira becomes involved in the Haldimand Affair. And the Haldimand Affair is extremely interesting. I should probably make a video about it all on its own, but in brief, essentially, the British, apparently, and this is done in secret, so we don't have a lot of documentation to really verify what happened here, but essentially, the British contact Vermont, and they propose, hey, Vermont, we understand the Americans aren't treating you very good. how would you like to become a part of Quebec? What? Quebec, you say? Yeah. They approach Vermont, and now both Ira Allen and some other leaders, including Ethan Allen, apparently had a bit of a quiet conversation with this. Now, it seems the argument made by Allen and the other Vermonteers was, hey, we were just playing with the British as a bargaining chip to get America to recognize us as a state. Obviously, you got Ira Allen, Ethan Allen, Seth Warner, although Seth Warner was on the other political spectrum and not involved in the Haldimand affair. But you have these, these leaders of Vermont who really want to be recognized as a state, and America just won't even bring it up in the conversation. So they were using the idea that the British are going to let us be our own state. We're going to be part of Quebec, but we'll be our own state. What do you think, America? And everyone in America was like, what are you doing? Stop it. And essentially, it fizzles out. Nothing comes of it. But it is a very interesting little side. And anything with the title affair in the American Revolution, I am slightly partial to. So, eventually, the Revolutionary War ceases hostilities, and Ira Allen, who has accumulated, even before this time, moved to Vermont because he had purchased a whole bunch of land. He actually ends up donating a gigantic portion of land and investing seed money to create what would later be known as the University of Virginia. And that's why the article actually titles him the father of the University of Virginia. That is the thing he is best known for, despite all the other stuff I've just mentioned. He ends up becoming, he leaves his positions in the government, but by 1791, Vermont does become the 14th state, the first state that wasn't a colony. And Ira Allen does live to see this. Now, he ends up going to he ends up going to France after this to purchase guns and ammunition to supply the Vermont militia. Of course, Vermont is on the border with British Canada. Unfortunately, he is actually captured, and this is much later on, closer to the War of 1812. He's actually captured by the British, and he is imprisoned in England with his supply for a brief time, but the supplies he purchased were held in Britain for 8 years. Now, after a long battle, Ira Allen is finally rewarded his guns and ammunition. Is finally sent back to Vermont, but because of the great expense he went to purchasing this, the time he spent in prison, and the fact that while he was overseas, a lot of the agents he entrusted with his property mishandled his finances, he ends up being broke. He even goes to a debtor's prison in Bennington for a short time, at which point he skips bail and flees. He leaves his adopted homeland that he's lived in for decades. He goes to Philadelphia because he hopes to correct his financial situation, but he falls ill and passes away shortly thereafter. And sadly, he's actually buried in an unmarked grave in a yard that has since been paved over. So, one of the most important and underappreciated founders of Vermont, American founders, founder of the University of Vermont, finds himself receiving the least ceremonial death and burial that you might get. Of course, there were soldiers who just left on the field. That's not, certainly not better. But Ira Allen is a fascinating character who unfortunately is not given the credit he deserves now, and was not given the credit he deserved when he passed away. So hopefully we've remedied that a little bit today. I sure hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the life of Ira Allen. Founder fans, that's it. That's all 7 for the week. Thank you so much for coming. I guess I went through it a little bit quickly. Some of them were a little short. I was just so excited to run through them. Thank you guys for coming. Make sure you hit like. For those of you who weren't here at the beginning, I do want to say again that this was a little bit of an experiment doing these weekly reviews on Sundays. I cannot keep up this routine. I apologize. For those of you who like it on Sundays, I really do apologize. Next Sunday, I will do it one more time, and then I'm going to take a little bit of a week off there. I'll be doing sporadic videos for a week. It's been 3 years with not a single day off. I'm going to visit some family. I will try and send you some videos over that week. And when I return, we're going to start doing these weekly wrap-ups on Thursdays. So, we'll have Monday through Friday, we'll have a founder, hopefully with a guest most days. Thursday, we'll do our weekly wrap-up. Friday, we will do trivia. And again, I apologize if that's inconvenient. I know a lot of you have come on board because I was doing this on Sundays, and I really am embarrassed to change it. But, look, today's was 2 hours late. I can never actually get it on time on Sundays. It is just, got a family here and these kids that as it gets nicer and nicer, they're just not going to be able to. We're going to do more stuff, and I have to honor that obligation to my family. So I do apologize to you guys if you are in any way hampered to make it. But we're going back to the only 5 days a week where I'm putting out videos at 8:15 Eastern Time. If you guys have questions or anything like that, Ginger, thank you so much. I do really appreciate you guys watching. Yeah, it is one of the great honors of my life that you take the time to enjoy and learn with me. I'm not looking for sympathy or anything like that. It's just hard to get the time to put it together appropriately to give you the most American Revolution I can in the most convenient way. I do hope you guys can make the change to Thursdays. I hope you're enjoying the interviews. There was only one last week. I got a few people lined up for this week. I'm going to take that little time off. But I'm going to be on the road. I'm going to be on Long Island. So I'm hopefully going to try and find a few places to go shoot on location, so to speak, if I can. So I will let you know about that. Hopefully you enjoy it. You guys are wonderful, great people. I really appreciate everything you do, coming and hitting like and subscribing. And I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.